All right, we are good. Welcome to Back to Thursdays here with the New York Giants Preservation Society. We have a nice crowd here tonight, over 30 people. Dan Levitt, who's coming out with a new book called BALK, is going to be talking about his book, and I invited him to talk because he's a regular member of our group, and I always try to have people who are part of the group and are doing something important, like Dan Taylor did. Even if it has not a great amount to do with the New York Giants, but Dan will weave something in with that. So Dan will be speaking to us. He'll tell us when his book will come out and everything about his book. Couple of other things. I spoke to Ozzy Virgil yesterday about this Willie Mays documentary. It was a weird thing. His daughter, I don't know, emailed me and gave me her phone number, and I was talking to her. Really, really nice lady. And then she gave me her father's phone number. And I said, you know, they're doing this Mays documentary. What do you think? You think your father would like to participate? And she was all gung-ho, and I spoke to him, and he was all gung-ho. So we are going to have him speak to our group as well. Once the daughter or the son, who used to be a major league player, go down to visit the dad, hopefully they'll give me a little, week's notice or whatever, and we will get him on. But he wants to do it. So he turned 89, I believe, on Monday was his birthday. So that's something really to look forward to. Next week is Memorial Day weekend. You guys, as a former teacher, I'm giving you the weekend off. So we will not have a meeting next week. We come back with Chris Epting, who is really a renaissance man. He does everything, finds baseball treasures, does TV shows, writes books. He's going to be talking about the Polo Grounds, especially next in 2 weeks, and other baseball minutiae. And I think you'll find him really interesting. I saw him speak, I don't know, maybe 12 or 13 years ago. He was fabulous, really entertaining, and he's a lot of fun. So anybody have any questions about anything or want to know what's going on, or are we good? All right, we're good. Dan Levitt is going to be addressing our group, so let's give it up to Dan Levitt. Dan, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be part of this group. I've had a bunch of enjoyable Thursday evenings over the last several months. As Gary mentioned, I'm working on a book with co-author Mark ARMOUR on baseball, cheating, innovation, and the interplay among them. We're hoping to submit a draft by October, and at the end of my comments, I'd welcome any thoughts or suggestions you might have. Once you start to dig in, it's clear that baseball and cheating have a long history together. Highly competitive athletes and front office personnel will do almost anything to win. For some, this includes cheating, especially if the rewards are high, the chances of being caught are low, and the penalties weak. When these three elements are present together, behavioral norms and rules become surrounded by chaos and controversy. Baseball and innovation also have a long history together, and a thin and often ambiguous line has existed between innovation and stepping over that line into cheating. It may not be all that surprising that those at the forefront of innovation are also those who push the boundaries between what's legal and what's not. Another theme of the book is the dramatic evolution of Americans' views on cheating. John McGraw and the Baltimore Orioles of the 1890s were grabbing opposing players' belts as they rounded the bases and hiding balls in the outfield. Those Orioles were baseball's best team. They were viewed as brutal and dishonest, but no one suggested their pennant should be forfeited. Moreover, in later years, the team was treated romantically, boys doing anything they could to win. Billy Martin once said, "Cheating in baseball is just like hot dogs, French fries, and cold Cokes." And as you remember, the famous spitball pitchers of the 1950s through the 1970s, like Whitey Ford and Gaylord Perry, were treated more like all-star wrestling villains than evil cheaters. Today, using illegal substances is back in the news. Cheating using new and more diverse compounds as a pitch aid are being treated much more seriously, as are all forms of cheating. We've broken our analysis into 9 chapters: gameplay, or I can refer to this as events on the field. Perhaps the best known example would be the NL's old Orioles I just mentioned. Then there's team building, the playing field, the pitcher, the batter, amphetamines and other non-anabolic drugs, anabolic steroids, database and new technology, and finally sign stealing. I'm going to share some of our stories and research from 6 of these chapters. As to the on-field shenanigans, McGraw was forced to tone it down when he joined the Giants a few years later. But the Giants' rivals and their backers still believed he was getting away with quite a bit. According to one Pittsburgh paper in 1906, and as you folks know, along with the Cubs, the Pirates were the Giants' most hated rivals at the time. All right, so here's the article. The umpires absolutely refused to see infractions of the rules on the part of McGraw's men. This is not a game played, there is not a game played by the Giants in which they do not violate some regulation, for which infraction they should be punished, but they seem to escape without any punishment whatever. Arthur Devlin bumps every runner who tries to round third base. Yesterday, he tried to stop Meyer when he was rounding third and almost sent the Princeton boys sprawling. The Giants also interfere with the fielders when they are trying to make a play. In the last play of the game yesterday, as Richie made his throw to Nealon, he was bumped by a Giant runner and sent head over heels to the ground. The Pirates also took issue with one of the Giants' on-field innovations. Giants catcher Roger Bresnahan sported white cricket-type shin guards for opening day in April 1907. Shin guards had been used sporadically in the past, but were often makeshift and smaller than cricket shin guards. Bresnahan's were worn on top of his pants as they are today, and it was said that, quote, spectators rather fancied the innovation. A month or so later, during a Giants-Pirates game, Pirates manager and center fielder Fred Clark twisted his ankle on a play at the plate. Clark blamed Bresnahan's willingness to block his path on the shin guards. Clark and team owner Barney Dreyfuss protested Bresnahan's apparent unfair advantage to league president Harry Pulliam, demanding that shin guards be banned. The rule covering wearables, however, did not exclude them. Pulliam upheld the right to don shin guards. They were not cheating. I'm only going to mention one bat doctoring incident. One of the first famous incidents involved Yankees third baseman Greg Nettles. At Tiger Stadium on September 7th, 1974, Nettle broke his bat on a bloop single to left field. As the story is now remembered and told, Nettle's bat had super balls inside and the players went running around picking up the bouncing balls. I naturally thought this would be a great story for the book. Made of highly highly resilient rubber, super balls were first introduced in 1965. So here we apparently had the surreptitious use of an innovative new substance. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear to be true. All of the contemporary sources said it was cork and not super balls. So there's not really an innovation angle to this story, but it does highlight how the league treated this type of cheating. Other than losing the single, Nettles was not disciplined. He played every game the rest of the year. In team building too, teams managed to find ways to cheat. Throughout baseball history, teams have occasionally cheated to find, keep, and develop the best players. Organized baseball as we know it today is based on a hierarchy of leagues and team control over player contracts through the reserve clause. Teams tried all sorts of chicanery to evade these restrictions. St. Louis Cardinals GM Branch Rickey, however, had a more strategic idea to get around them. He thought it would save money too. To execute on his scheme, in the early 1920s, Rickey began building baseball's first farm system. He described the rationale behind his innovation. We finished in last place, and I said to myself, what can I do about it? I have no money. Clubs usually finish last on merit because they do not have enough good players. Now, a club in the condition in which the St. Louis Club was at that time could buy, for a small price, a part of the club at Fort Smith, or 18% at Houston, or 50% at Syracuse, and then out of trial and error, find that the investments were good or bad, and come to the place where it would own a small minor league club, where it could put its players recommended by a personal friend here or there, or a limited number of scouts, which you could afford to employ. Only a few years after Rickey's innovation, he and others started taking advantage of it to skirt the player control rules. Rickey himself perpetuated one of the larger exposed cheating scandals. Those who come up with innovative approaches are often the same people who push the boundaries. Rickey had built baseball's most extensive farm system. The Cardinals had an affiliate in nearly every minor league. To secure even greater coverage, Rickey created a second shadow farm system. He did this through his relationship and financial support of the Class A Cedar Rapids Club. Cedar Rapids set up its own working relationships with other teams in the same low minor leagues that St. Louis had affiliates in. This was a blatant no-no. Teams were not allowed to control more than one team in a league. When finally uncovered to its full extent, Commissioner Landis declared 91 farmhands from the affected clubs free agents. Of the 91, however, only outfielder Pete Reeser went on to star in the majors. Perhaps the most discussed form of cheating over the past several decades is performance-enhancing drugs. Personally, I actually sort of dislike discussing the subject because it becomes emotional so quickly on both sides. What is instructive from a history of cheating perspective and innovation, however, is what was legal when and how it was perceived. To put this in perspective, the search for performance-enhancing substances is nothing new. As long as there have been organized athletics, competitors have looked for ways to gain an advantage. In pre-modern times, athletes looked for any possible advantage from ingestibles, and this was considered perfectly permissible. The original Greek Olympians experimented with a multitude of dietary innovations. Huge portions of meat consisting of up to 10 pounds of lamb per day. Various herbal treatments, dried figs, wet cheese and wheat meal, psychoactive mushrooms, and brandy and wine as stimulants, possibly even mixed with strychnine for added effect. The use of performance enhancers remained little unchanged until the middle of the 19th century. At this point, three developments fundamentally transformed what might be accomplished. First, the invention of the syringe provided for subcutaneous and intramuscular injections. Substances could now be delivered directly into the body without having to go through the digestive process and its diluting effects. Substances could also be administered locally, targeting a specific part of the body. Second, advances in synthetic organic chemistry created a new science that could, in predictable, if still rudimentary ways, modify human physiological reactions. And third, there was the emergence of a modern pharmaceutical industry and medical research institutions with expanding research and development capabilities. These three developments created a formidable new platform for new drugs. No longer would one need to find herbs or dried figs to eat. Injecting synthetic compounds under the skin presents a wildly different context than eating naturally occurring ones. Steroids in baseball go all the way back to 1889, maybe. In June of that year, a renowned French physiologist and neurologist named Charles Edward Brown-Séquard announced he had found a miraculous anti-aging elixir. It consisted of a water-based extract made from the ground-up testes of dogs and guinea pigs. His lofty reputation, along with the significance of his potion's alleged effects, spawned widespread anticipation. By the end of the year, more than 12,000 physicians around the world were dispensing it. One person who purportedly took the elixir was 32-year-old Pittsburgh pitching star and future Hall of Famer Pud Galvin. On Monday, August 12, 1889, according to the Washington Post Small Baseball Notes article, Galvin was administered the potion at a medical clinic in Pittsburgh. Given the notoriety of Brown-Séquard's concoction, it is not surprising that baseball players might have experimented with it. What is surprising, however, is that no other mention was made of Galvin's therapy in any other paper. This gives real pause to the accuracy of the Post notes column. In any case, there was no long-term rejuvenation of Galvin's ability. In fact, Brown-Séquard was onto something, that the secretions of the internal organs affect the body, but his actual elixir would not have provided a testosterone boost. From a technical standpoint, there wouldn't have been any noticeable effect because little hormone would have dissolved in water. Any improved performance was due to a placebo effect. Once synthetic testosterone first became available in 1935, however, researchers began exploring its many possible uses as a therapy for various conditions. One early steroid researcher wrote in 1945 regarding the previous year's World Series participants. We know how both the St. Louis Cardinals and the St. Louis Browns have won championships supercharged by vitamins. It would be interesting to watch the productive power of an industry of a professional group that would try a systematic supercharge with testosterone. During the 1950s, weightlifters discovered the power and strength-building characteristics of this innovative new substance. But baseball players were some of the last athletes to consider steroids to be of assistance in their craft. Meaningful muscle building from weight training was generally believed to curtail flexibility and hinder overall batting ability. Some pitchers, however, were using steroids by the early 1970s. The team physician of the Washington Senators was running a steroid program for several pitchers. During the 1960s and even into the 1970s, it's hard to categorize early steroid users as cheaters. There was no rule against it. There was no test for it. They were not illegal under US law. And the medical community was well behind the users, mostly still believing steroids offered little more than a placebo effect. The use of and reaction to steroids evolved in fits and starts over the next half century. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, drugs in sports became a hot topic. Drug testing was introduced at the 1968 Olympics, though not for steroids, as no test yet existed. In 1969, Sports Illustrated printed an expose of drugs in sport. In the article, baseball's executives pretty much admitted there was no rule against drug use. NL President Warren Giles said, "Nothing has ever come to my attention that would require a special ruling. It has never come up, and I don't think it ever will." AL executive Bob Holbrook was even more definitive. "The American League has no rules regarding pep pills, painkillers, etc. Baseball players don't use those types of things." This changed for some drugs with the Federal Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which regulated drugs with the potential for abuse. Commissioner Bowie Kuhn introduced a drug education and prevention program in March of 1971. The program stated that baseball must insist its personnel comply with federal and state drug laws. However, it was geared almost exclusively to the abuse of recreational drugs as opposed to performance enhancement. Neither the Federal Controlled Substances Act nor Kuhn's program included steroids. Part of the confusion over the next 2 decades resulted from a lack of recognition of their effectiveness by the medical community and consequently the federal government. In 1972, the FDA actually required an information label on Dianabol, the fundamental weightlifter anabolic steroid from the 1950s, stating that anabolic steroids do not enhance athletic ability. Coming out of the cocaine scandals of the mid-1980s, the owners demanded drug testing. The players' union refused. At this point, no agreement existed on how to handle drugs in baseball. The sport would remain without a formal joint drug agreement until early into the 21st century. But it needs to be remembered that this testing was to be for illegal recreational drug use, not performance-enhancing ones. In the late 1980s, anabolic steroids were being more widely introduced into baseball, and their legality was changing as well. In 1990, after hearings led by then Senator Joe Biden, Congress added anabolic steroids as a drug of abuse under the Federal Controlled Substances Act. Though baseball had no specific prohibition on steroids, once anabolic steroids were classified in 1990, they clearly would fall under the drugs of abuse, which were prohibited. And baseball's policy obligated the teams to help police drug use. They were required to disclose knowledge of player drug use to the commissioner's office or risk a $250,000 fine, the highest then permissible. In 1991, Commissioner Fay Vincent issued a memo revising the earlier drug policy language to include steroids. In some ways, specifically calling out steroids was redundant given they were already classified as a drug of abuse, but it highlighted baseball's budding recognition of the issue. He also understood his limitations relative to the players, saying, "The union, of course, wouldn't let me discipline players away from the federal statute. That is, unless the government enforced the statute, the union's position was I couldn't enforce the statute," which was mostly irrelevant because they had no testing mechanism anyway. In the first real expose of steroids in baseball, in July 1995, Los Angeles Times reporter Bob Nightingale examined the issue. Padres GM Randy Smith estimated 10 to 20% of the players used them. An unidentified AL GM thought it was more like 30%. So how should we view steroids at the end of the 1990s? Well, for one thing, we can say that steroids were clearly cheating. There were rules against them. They were controlled substances and were therefore prohibited as well. And the code of silence and denial enveloping their use testified that users recognized them as cheating. All that said, there is still something a little unsettling in this absolutism. There is a sense that the severity of an action can be judged by how hard one tries to prevent it and the consequences of being caught. The old adage, the punishment should fit the crime. And at the time, the consequences of taking illegal steroids were almost non-existent. There was very little chance of being caught given the lack of testing. Even if a player was caught, the penalties were likely to be nominal for a first-time offense. The commissioner's office and the team front offices also didn't seem to be particularly interested in policing its use. No team had been fined $250,000 by the commissioner's office for failing to report a suspected steroid user. Nor did the commissioner use the bully pulpit and speak often and forcefully against their use. And even with the intransigence of the union on random testing, MLB could have taken a more aggressive posture relative to minor league players who were not shielded by the union. MLB banned tobacco, both cigarettes and smokeless, in the minors in 1993. In 1994, the Mets, on their own initiative, tested several minor leaguers they suspected of using steroids, but the program petered out after the strike. San Diego began randomly testing their minor leaguers in 1998. Roughly 20% tested positive. Nevertheless, baseball overall waited until 2001 to begin testing minor leaguers on a formal basis. As the 21st century dawned, however, Commissioner Seelig became more assertive on ridding the game of performance-enhancing drugs. He was soon gifted negotiating leverage with the union. It started when the June 2nd, 2002 issue of Sports Illustrated published a bombshell expose. 1996 NL MVP Ken Caminiti admitted his use of steroids, the first baseball player to publicly confess, while estimating that half of the players used them. A couple of weeks later, the U.S. Senate held hearings on steroids and cheating in baseball. Under the implied pressure from Congress, in August, the union agreed to include anonymous survey testing in 2003. If more than 5% of the players tested positive, mandatory drug testing would begin in 2004. On November 13, 2003, the results were announced. More than the threshold tested positive. Baseball would now have mandatory drug testing. 2 months before the announcement of the failed test results, another steroid storm exploded over baseball. Federal law enforcement agents raided Bay Area Laboratory Cooperative, the BALK, a company that supplied performance-enhancing drugs to, in their words, world-class athletes. The documentary evidence uncovered by the government and follow-on interviews led to a grand jury investigation. A number of baseball players linked to the facility were called as witnesses, most notably Barry Bonds, Gary Sheffield, and Jason Giambi. From this perspective of cheating and innovation, the investigation highlighted the rapid innovation in PED technology and the sophisticated administration of their use. Baseball players were no longer taking the easily detectable steroids introduced decades earlier. BALK experimented on its own and with independent designers to devise steroids that were undetectable in drug tests. Hence the introduction of the infamous performance-enhancing substances, the cream and the clear. Once again, the link between innovation and cheating came to the fore. The cheating process itself had also become much more sophisticated. No longer was steroid use a matter of a player injecting himself or a fellow player. It was now complex and organized. Athletes were using sophisticated schedules to determine precisely when to take which compound for maximum effect and minimum chance of getting caught. Congress remained engaged in the problem of PEDs in baseball as well. In May 2005, the House and Senate introduced the Clean Sports Act, under which drug testing for the 4 major professional sports leagues would be federalized under a drug czar. The bill proposed much more draconian penalties. In November 2005, under the continued pressure from both the government and Seelig, the union acquiesced to a significant revision to the PED policy. Stiffer penalties were now in place if a player was caught. Much of the ambiguity and chaos surrounding a banned substance without credible enforcement mechanisms or discipline was finally eliminated. Along with drugs, the other big cheating scandal in the news lately is sign stealing. Stealing signs is nearly as old as the signs themselves. All that has changed is the evolving technologies that have been applied and the rules, or lack thereof, to rein it in. Modern high-quality prism binoculars were first sold in 1894. It didn't take long for someone in baseball to figure out how to use them to their advantage. In 1899, that someone was Morgan Murphy, a backup catcher on the Phillies and sign stealer extraordinaire. From today's perspective, Murphy's arrangement presents intriguing parallels to the recent Astros controversy. The Astros sign stealing was first formally exposed in a November 2019 article in The Athletic. The only player willing to go on record was pitcher Mike Fiers. Mirroring Fiers, many details of the Phillies scheme were initially revealed by a pitcher who was no longer with the club. Bill McGee was sold to Philadelphia around mid-season, where he witnessed Murphy's antics. Like the modern Astros, the scheme evolved into a complex multi-person affair. As McGee described the operation, Murphy stationed himself in manager Billy Shetline's suite in center field with a pair of $75 binoculars. This new technology was not cheap. The average annual salary for a manufacturing employee was roughly $500, and starting ball players earned perhaps 4 times that. In fact, owner Colonel John Rogers refused to reimburse Murphy for the binoculars unless he proved he could successfully pull off the scheme. After deciphering the catcher's signals, Murphy pulled an awning on the left side of the window for a breaking ball and the right side for a fastball. At the time, this program was frowned upon, but not technically illegal, and players and executives were struggling with how to respond, as one conflicted Philadelphia player observed. Morgan Murphy has earned every dollar of his salary this season. Had it not been for the Signal Service Department, we would have been in the second division, as every game we have won has been won with the bat. And in many games where Morgan was not working, we could not hit a balloon and were easily beaten. There is another club up among the leaders that has been working a similar racket. This scheme may be considered legitimate, yet a game won by such means cannot be said to have been won upon its merits. As an aside, the Phillies improved that year from 78 wins to 94 wins. The next year, Murphy and the Phillies raised their scheme another notch. The club installed an elaborate electronic system. Under the third base coaching box, they buried a telegraphic sounder. This was a piece of equipment used in the telegraph industry and transmission that acted like a buzzer. Someone standing over it could sense it on his foot. Murphy, stationed out in center field, would determine the pitch and relay it by buzzing the third base coach, who would then communicate to the batter using some sort of prearranged remark or code words. In mid-September, the buzzer system was formally exposed when Red shortstop Tommy Corcoran started digging around the coach's box. Cincinnati manager Bob Allen described the counter operation. It was tipped off to us. I won't say by whom. I called on manager Shetline at the clubhouse on some pretext and kept my eyes skinned for wires. I detected 2 running into an upper window of the clubhouse. Monday, Tom Corcoran started to dig into the box. He did this gradually in order to avoid detection. Every inning, he got a little deeper, and finally he struck a board. Then the Philadelphia players, the groundskeeper, and policemen rushed at him and threatened to have him put off the grounds and arrested for malicious destruction of property. Tom, however, pulled up the board and buzzer, wires, battery, and all were exposed.
What?
That device has won many games for the Phillies this year. By the 1950s, sign stealing was once again in the news. And once again, baseball frowned on it, but wouldn't say it was illegal. At one point, Baltimore manager Paul Richards complained about sign stealing. AL President Will Harridge said, "So far as the American League is concerned, there is no rule for it or against it." He then threw up his hands on the issue. This comes up every once in a while when some team gets on a losing streak. But even if there was a rule against it, I can't see how we could possibly police it. If we definitely saw somebody out in center field with some big machine, our umpires would make an honest effort to stop it. But if the person running the machine refused to move, I don't know what the umpires could do. We've had periodic conversation about stealing signs over a long period of years. Not surprisingly, this did little to discourage mechanical sign stealing. The Giants unveiled a new operation during the September 1959 pennant race. According to one unnamed player, the fellow worked from the scoreboard. He kept 2 slats open. Where the pitch was to be a fastball, he closed the right slat. For a curveball, he closed the left one. We used it in the final 2 games we played with the Braves in their final visit to San Francisco. Only the guys in the regular lineup were in on the plot, but the rest of us soon found out about it. Lou Burdett shut us out in the opener, but the next day we beat Warren Spahn 13-4. After the victory over Spahn, the Giants were 2 games ahead with 8 to go. 30-year-old journeyman pitcher Al Worthington, however, went to manager Bill Rigney and told him he believed spying from center field was cheating. He said he would quit if Rigney didn't stop it. Somewhat surprisingly, the Giants terminated their spying after Worthington's ultimatum. He was a useful pitcher, but not really essential to the squad. One can only wonder at the commitment of the regulars to the program in the first place, if they were willing to give it up so easily. Worthington later mentioned that Rigney was a good friend and said many players did not like the idea of sign stealing. In their subsequent series against the Dodgers, San Francisco lost all 3 games and eventually the pennant. Lastly, I'll talk about the most recent area in which teams have tried to cheat: high technology. Until the 21st century, few would have argued that teams had trade secrets worth stealing. Teams maintained detailed scouting reports on amateur and professional players, but these would have been stored in paper files. This all changed in the spring of 2000, 3 years before the release of Moneyball. The Cleveland Indians debuted their all-encompassing database. Rudimentary by today's standards, the database computerized their scouts' grades and other information along with proprietary statistical rankings. The ability to quickly access all of this disparate information within the organization offered a fresh advantage when evaluating player transactions. Cleveland's analytical approach reflected the confluence of 2 ripening innovations. 1, the introduction of new insights from using an analytical approach, and 2, the reduction in cost of computing power to where frugal front offices could experiment with their utility. A decade later in St. Louis, front office executive Chris Correa couldn't resist the temptation to hack into Houston's new database. Jeff Luhnow had recently left St. Louis to take over as GM in Houston, bringing along another front office exec from St. Louis, Sig Megdo. Luhnow and his software engineers soon built a state-of-the-art database, which they dubbed Ground Control. Correa's hack represented the first recorded case of team versus team industrial espionage. According to the government's later investigation, Correa's access covered at least 15 months, from March 2013 to June 2014, and totaled 50 or more intrusions. Correa's extensive rummaging around in the Astros database included review of the Astros scouting information, player rankings, medical information, and trade talk notes. As part of the court process, the value of the stolen information was placed at $1.7 million. The specific formula was not disclosed, but in outline, this amount represented the value of scouting information on the 200 or so players Correa inspected for the 2013 draft. Correa was sentenced to 46 months in prison and also ordered to pay around $280,000 in restitution. Major League Baseball performed its own investigation. Commissioner Manfred awarded Houston the Cardinals' 2 highest draft picks in the 2017 draft. One can only imagine additional future opportunities to take unfair advantage of high technology. As technology becomes more and more part of the game, so will unforeseen opportunities to cheat. And as we have seen, all innovation is not technological. Here too, unforeseen opportunities to cheat will surely appear. I'm happy to take any questions or suggestions. Thank you.
Dan, thank you so much. When will this book be published?
Hopefully in the spring. So the plan is we turn it in sometime late this year, November roughly, and then it comes out in the spring.
Is there anything on
We're still working on it.
Is there anything on
Go
the
ahead,
51 Giants, or you feel that's been covered enough?
No, we talk about it. We talk about it, but obviously it's been covered very well. But it's got to be part of the story.
Anybody with a question?
Yeah, I've got a question. Yeah, Dan, it was very interesting. Enjoyed it. Getting into the 60s and what the laws were on steroids, stuff like that. What about greenies, amphetamines? Were they illegal at the time?
Well, we have a whole chapter on greenies too, which I didn't really, which I didn't talk a whole lot about because it the drug stuff just gets kind of along with that. But there's a lot going on there. Essentially, greenies were made part of the Federal Controlled Substances Act of 1970, but nobody really took it seriously. Up until 1970, I mean, they were distributed by the trainers. You know, Jim Brosnan, in his great book, talked about that the trainers were giving him greenies, and you know, there was no feedback, no pushback at all. You know, Bob Cousy actually talked about taking greenies in for the 1960 NBA championship. And so people just talked about, I mean, and then he sort of later talked about it not quite as directly. So, you know, I think it was much more, it was clearly much more acceptable. You know, there was Reggie Jackson was talked about taking him. People talked about taking him. But, Tony Gwynn had the famous quote, people assume greenies were cheating, steroids aren't. So I would say they were kind of like steroids before there were penalties, right? I mean, it was technically you weren't allowed to do it. And well, first of all, with amphetamines, if you had a prescription, you were allowed to do it, period. I mean, there was the Phillies, you guys might remember the Phillies scandal in 1980, where those guys all went on the stand and, and it turned out they all said that the prescriptions weren't for them. I can get into the long story, but we talk about it in the book. So I would say, Stu, that, nobody really considered it cheating. It was a long season, and this was just kind of what you needed to do to stay awake. Obviously, once they were made part of the drug testing stuff in the early 2000s, then it was cheating. But it's kind of nebulous because, again, technically they were banned unless you had a prescription, but there was no penalty for it. There was no testing for it, and people didn't really consider it cheating. So it's kind of ambiguous.
So I have a question.
Yeah, Perry and then Harvey Weinberg.
Thank you. Hi, Gary.
Hey, Perry. Good to see you.
Thank you. So are you currently in hiding? Do you fear for your safety? Because I fear for your safety. I mean, the subjects that you're touching on, surely there's going to be somebody who's going to be wanting to retaliate or stop you from revealing something, or I'm serious. You're drawing the curtain back on a lot of rot, and somebody's got to be not thrilled about what you're doing. Have you experienced a lot of pushback, or have you gotten any?
Well, I mean, we're not, I mean, the drug thing gets the most interest, but I mean, we're not named, I mean, we don't have any new names or anything, right? I mean, we're just sort of
still,
talking about, I mean, but it is so emotional, right? I mean, some people view it as, kind of the worst thing that ever happened. And, that era doesn't count in baseball history. And, other people are like, well, it doesn't matter. And I mean, we're trying to put it into a little bit of perspective without sort of coming down too hard on one side or the other.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping people don't take it that way, Barry.
No, I mean, I hope so too.
Yeah.
But thank you for writing this. It sounds like something that you tie a lot of threads together and follow a lot of dots that, need to be connected, so that people know what's been going on. Yeah. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
All right, we got Harvey Weinberg.
Dan, I have a
Was I going through, you're watching this too, right?
basic question.
Oh, okay.
What is your definition of cheating? And let me speak to that for a second. I'm thinking of Barry Bonds. It seems to me from his record, which was revealed starkly in a book called Game of Shadows. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
Bonds's production as a superstar skyrocketed after he definitely started using performance-enhancing drugs. That's proven. Everybody on field knew he was using. They knew he was a good ball player. He was a superstar. What the steroids did was made him Superman. And I remember reading a report, I don't know where, I haven't researched it, I wasn't prepared for this tonight, that Selig was given a copy of Game of Shadows, and when he looked at the appendix, which showed Bonds' record when he turned 40 or 42, whatever the age was, the advanced age, he realized that you could take a ball player like Mark McGuire, who was a good ball player, and turn him into a superstar, but what you would turn Barry Bonds into was Superman. But the players on the field knew Bonds was using. They knew he was using steroids. Part of the numbers that don't get enough published discussion is Bonds was walked an enormous amount of times. Nobody wanted to deal with it. So when I talk about cheating, to me, cheating is the Black Sox scandal. It's cheating to fix a game. It's cheating to really undermine the integrity of the game. Whereas Bonds was using to enhance his numbers to try and win for the Giants. He was trying to get more hits, trying to hit more home runs, and everybody knew it. So in your book, do you deal with the esoteric concept, dealing with that aspect of, is that cheating if I know Barry Bonds is using steroids?
Well, let me take a stab at a little of that. First of all, I'll give the broad answer. We are only dealing with cheating in terms of trying to do something to make your team win. So how something to help you win. So the Black Sox, I certainly, you could define it as cheating if you want, but that's not that's not how we're defining it for the book. As to Bonds, part of the problem is we don't know whether it was 20% that were using it or 50, and we don't know who was using it. So it's hard to, the Mitchell report basically had all the public names and then the games they got out of the Met, right? Kirk Redmowski, and nobody else talked, and so it's hard. And I'm going back to it. We don't want to start pointing fingers at people when we just don't know. There may have been very few others, and there may have been a lot of others, and it's just it's unknowable, and so that's what makes it so hard to start pointing fingers. But yeah, you're right. That they were trying to be better, all of them, to be better and to have better numbers, and how one views that is, I think, sort of a personal choice.
Hey, Gary, I got a couple of questions.
Yeah, Kevin, we got a list. You're on the list, but we got a few people before you.
Okay.
Charles, you're up. Charles, then John, then Ed, then Lee, then Kevin.
Yeah, my question is does Gaylord Perry have a chapter for himself?
We do have a chapter
how much of Gaylord Perry was like actual cheating, and how much was psychology using it against the hitters?
It's hard to know. I think we've read a lot of the umpire books. I love the umpire books. I don't know if you've read but all the umpire books say, all the umpires think that that Perry was cheating. If you read the umpire books, they all talk about various instances where they thought, where the ball was falling off the table, or he went out there and there was Vaseline all over the ball. And, I think he was only ejected a couple of times in his career. Maybe it was just once, and that wasn't until fairly late. But my take is, from reading the umpire books, that that it was not just the psychological, the psychological part of it.
John, you're up. John, you got to unmute.
Yep. Sorry, Gary. I was taking my hand down first. Sorry. Dan, it seems as if the steroid users are kind of taken in their own category. The cheaters from other eras, or the rule benders, if you will, are kind of viewed more like lovable characters to some extent, where the steroid people are vilified. Do you think that any of the steroid people will get in to the Hall of Fame eventually? And also the Astros, how do they play out down the road in terms of Hall of Famers? Because they've been vilified almost to a higher level than the steroid people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think part of it has to do with how, to a certain degree, is how easy it is to catch somebody, right? To a certain degree, if you're putting Vaseline on a baseball, you're out there and the umpire can see you. If you're taking steroids, you're only going to get caught if there's testing. So to a certain degree, I think there's that how hard it is to catch has something to do with it. And this is a complete aside, but when Correa was put in jail for 46 months for the for the hacking, part of, I think, the rationale was that, if you catch, it's so hard to catch somebody that if you do, you have to give them a fairly significant penalty. And so I think there's a little of that going on. My sense is that, we're going to know a whole lot more about how steroids are going to be when we see, sort of what happens to, Alex Rodriguez here in this coming year. My sense is it's still going to be a long time. I see it sort of, Bonds, what Clemens peaked at 60%. And, I don't know. I think the Astros thing's going to blow over a little bit quicker. I just, it was only 1 or 2 years. And so I think that'll blow over a little bit quicker. We'll see.
Ed Freer, you're up.
Yeah, hi, thanks very much. This is an interesting topic. Kind of piggybacking on what John just said, in a way of a recommendation, the older players were considered more lovable with what things they did. And I've always, and you alluded to it in the beginning of your topic about the hidden ball in the right field, Wee Willie Keeler.
Right.
We kept the ball there. And I think that Oregon team also cemented home plate so they could get the Baltimore chop. Different things like that, which are kind of humorous. Are they, did you amplify them in your book, or could you still?
No, I thank you for the suggestion. We're talking a little bit about, groundskeeping and how teams, would, when Murray Wills came to town, teams would, make the base paths super wet to make it harder for him to steal. And, there was all that stuff, the old Metrodome, there's the story. And I think it's probably true. I don't think it made any difference where they turned the air conditioning fan on to help blow the ball out when the Twins were up. So some of that stuff is sort of humorous in retrospect, but obviously to the degree it really made a difference, it's obviously fairly serious. But you're right. I mean, I agree. There's a lot of other stuff going on, and but
Kind of
I think that, yeah.
All right, we got Lee, Kevin, and then Renee. Lee?
Yeah, it's a very interesting presentation. A prelude, Caminiti in that same article that you quoted said, I've done a lot of bad things in my life, and he died not long after that article. But he said that taking steroids is something he's not ashamed of. Yeah, so that right. Raises the issue of how hard it is to deal with. And I was just wondering if are you going to begin or devote anything to the whole concept of the stolen base in baseball? I mean, I can't think of any sport that in the early days anyway, and at the time of Wills and Henderson and of course Cobb, made a thing out of a stolen base. I mean, sport is always talking about playing within the rules and where the level playing field, but I just throw it out as an example of why one of the reasons I love baseball, because it's not so easily determined, and why I hate most analytics. But I thought it might be a good start to your book too, because it's I can't think of another sport that lionizes a concept that so, at least in the verbiage, illegal.
That's funny. We had not thought about stolen base, obviously, because they're legal, but just that the fact that the term is used is rather interesting.
And it's also you mentioned you're onto some great stuff, Dan, because you're mentioning the attitudes toward cheating has changed a lot, and the fact they allow an oven mitt on base stealers now, which to me is, I mean, it's supposed to be a game between equal humans or with different skills, and it's so palpable that it's something extra that shouldn't really be within the rules.
Right. Well, that was sort of like with Bresnahan, back in 1907, he put on those shin guards, and I mean, obviously, I think we all believe catchers now need them, but right, I mean, that was sort of the start of the body armor a little bit. Yeah, no, that's interesting. With the big elbow, when the batters have the giant, the giant elbow pads on and lean over the plate.
Thanks, Lee. Kevin, you're up.
Okay, I got a question and a couple of comments. First of all, on the cover of your book, will you have any banging trash cans?
We haven't figured out the cover yet, but that's probably it's probably not a bad one to do.
Okay, and then just a couple of comments. I just want to know what your opinion on, back in the late 90s, obviously, don't you feel MLB turned a blind eye because of the work stoppage? And then McGuire and Sosa kind of brought baseball back because at the time, the NFL, NBA were kind of moving their way up. Baseball in the inner city wasn't being played as much. But in a sense, don't you feel at that time, a blind eye was turned because baseball needed to get back to the forefront?
I don't know. I mean, how purposeful it was probably purposeful on some people, right? I mean, Selig basically has said that the Andros story from McGuire's locker was one of the things that really sort of turned his eye around. And so that would have been, towards the end of that. But obviously the Nightingale expose came out in 95. So it's hard to know. I mean, how much was turning a blind eye and how much was they just didn't, really feel like investigating it because, it was obviously going to turn a bad light on the league. And of course, I don't know. I think Ripken's streak too helped bring baseball back. And so I think the home run race, if you will, was huge. But I don't know. It's a good question. It's hard to know what they were thinking. But I know Selig has said that the Andros story was one of the things that made it that turned his views around.
And then one last comment, and then I'll get off here. I know the previous gentleman talked about the different eras. Guys were viewed differently and stuff like that. My point, and what I think, as I mentioned this before in a different sport, is modern technology, media. I mean, you can see everything now in baseball with the MLB network. Every game's televised. Everything is put down in slow motion and stuff like that. So, getting to people today, everything the Astros did was basically put under the microscope where, you go back, I don't know, 1930s, 1940s. Right. You don't have the media that we had like we do today where you can see everything either on social media or on MLB network. I'll take it off the air.
Right. Yep. You're right.
Renee, you're up.
Yeah. Great introduction. I really appreciate, and I love the research that you did for this. This has got to be like a historical, chronological, in order history of cheating. With that being said, and MLB turning a blind eye, for one reason I always believe is because it's generating revenue. Why say anything? I mean, they're just as guilty as the players doing it because it's more people at the ballpark, people watching on TV. But and I don't know if this is true, so I'm just saying, Major League Baseball eventually finds out what books come out, either promoted or not. Has Major League Baseball heard about this research, this book you're doing, and has asked you any questions about the book?
No, to be honest with you, this is really the first time Mark or I have talked extensively about the research in the book. So we need to work. I mean, I'd like to try and get some publicity that way, and I'm curious what they would say. So yeah, no, I appreciate the thought, and maybe we can get a little bit of reaction out of them.
You see, my reason for that is because I mean, obviously, they've turned a blind eye, but using that book as a reference material to look into the game even more deeply. And granted, blind eye years ago, it may not happen today, but just another look again of any efforts of any teams doing anything of that nature. That's what I'm getting at, really.
Right.
Thanks, Renee.
I appreciate it. I think that's a good point.
Jeff Stewart, you're up.
Did you mention the Giants, who they were accused of stealing signs in 1951 before the shot heard around the world?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't talk about it here, but Joshua Prager did a whole book on it, but yes.
Okay. This is not
Yep.
to baseball. You know, I mean, you did it from the baseball perspective, but the PEDs and stuff, it's certainly not unique to baseball.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree. The PEDs and the amphetamines are not unique to baseball. I think, it came to baseball later, and I think it came much more with publicity, right? I mean, if you look at the NFL, there's Steve Corson and, Joe Fields of the Jets, who talked about it. That was really in the 80s, and the NFL had
Alzado too.
Yeah. And so the NFL had testing by 87 for steroids. I don't know how, efficient it was relative to beating the test, but so I just think there was just much more publicity around it in baseball. And that's another thing is why the publicity in baseball around it was so much bigger than in any other sport.
I have a couple friends who lift weights, and it was very, very prevalent among weightlifters long before I ever heard it mentioned in the
Right.
Thanks, Jeff. Bob K, you're up.
Thank you. My question is, where does gamesmanship end and cheating begin?
Well, I mean, it's a fine line. I mean, I think there's sort of defined rules, and if you go over the rules, I mean, there's a fairly defined line. The question is sort of, there's all these unwritten rules that again, sort of like amphetamines in the 70s, people took them and nobody really did anything about it. But, technically it was a controlled substance, and baseball players are not allowed to use a controlled substance, but no one really cared. So, I mean, right. I don't, Bob, I mean, I think it's a good question, and that's part of what we try and lay out what the lines were and what the punishments were. It's, if you're driving 70 miles an hour in a 55 zone, I mean, right, is that how, some things are much more illegal than others. And I think that the biggest problem with what we feel about steroids and some of this other stuff is that the punishment didn't fit what we viewed the crime was, right? I mean, to the degree we view steroids as sort of changing the nature of baseball somehow, and yet there was no real consequences for taking it. So that led to sort of this chaos and controversy, I think, that we all lived with for, really for 15 years, right? From the early 90s until about 2005, when testing really became efficient and penalties mattered.
Thank you.
Norm, you're up.
Hi, Dan. Dan, this is a great presentation. Thank you very much. I'm wondering about how far you go into management complicity in terms of the steroids. And I've got like 3 examples. One would be the androstenedione thing, where pretty much the reporter was vilified for asking the question about what is that in your locker. The next thing is the week before Tony La Russa was inducted to the Hall of Fame, he did an interview where someone asked him about the steroids, and he said, we, the managers, knew they were using steroids. We reported it to the people above us, and nothing ever happened. And the third thing is things like this. I don't know if you can see this. This is a bulked up Greg Maddox doll that was sold in the 1990s. And management was making money off of the bulked up players and their steroids. So I'm just curious how deeply you go into that in your book.
We talk about it some. I mean, it's hard to know what was complicity and what was just sort of ignorance. But, I mean, and it wasn't just, I mean, with Steve Wilstein, I mean, it wasn't just management, it was other reporters vilified him. I mean, he was vilified by other reporters as well. I mean, it was sort of the whole industry came down on him. And so it's hard, but yeah, I totally agree. And that's what I was talking about. I mean, a couple of the teams that took it seriously, the Mets in '94 and the Padres in '98, started testing their minor leaguers. Nobody else started doing that. I mean, if teams took it seriously, they could have done that. You technically had a rule where if you suspected someone of taking illegal drugs, you were supposed to report them. As far as my research says, nobody was ever reported. So the teams weren't really taking it seriously either. So I mean, we talk about that. It's hard to point fingers and say, this person here, sort of let it go. But I totally agree with your sentiment that that nobody was really was working too hard to try and rein it in.
All right, we got Charles and then back to Renee. Charles, you're up.
Okay, actually, I think that was my hand up from like a previous thing.
Oh.
Well, I actually still have a second question though. And that is, I heard back, and I don't know who reported this, it's vague on my memory, but I heard they used to have like two different kinds of coffee. One was like extra coffee with amphetamines in it, and the other was like regular coffee. Is that true, or is that something I misremembered?
Well, up until 1970, the trainers gave out amphetamines. After 1970, the baseball team physicians got together and said, we're not doing this anymore. Plus amphetamines are made a controlled substance, so you couldn't just get them anywhere anymore. So I would say that before 1970, probably anything was going on. After that, I think that players who were doing them were either had a prescription from a friendly doctor or were getting them from a friend. But I don't think that there's very little evidence that the teams were still giving them out in the 70s.
Okay, this was more something I'd heard, I think, like the mid 60s. So that may have been.
That wouldn't surprise me.
Okay.
I mean, there's Ron Mix of the San Diego Chargers talks about that, back in 1963, the trainers were like putting, steroids in bowls at the dinner, at their training tables, and they were just supposed to take handfuls of them.
Renee, you're up.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I heard this clearly. Is it in the book about how ownership and fandom increased because of the fact that players do what they do and they win and they create higher revenue? I mean, is there a different, is there a difference in the book of that? Like this is what happened last year and this year because of what's going on, and obviously because the team is winning and they're generating new fans, but because of that, steroids had something to do with it. You know what I'm saying? Is that in the book? That type of
we're not making that case. I mean, maybe. I'm curious what people think, and maybe we should make that case. I don't know that. I think that the home run race was great for baseball. Unfortunately, but obviously, other than the steroids were an issue, and people were all enthused. I think baseball would have come back one way or the other, and I also think that what really brought baseball back before that was the Ripken streak. So
absolutely, I'm a big baseball fan, so I agree with that. I really do. So I'm just wondering because big businesses make money, and whatever it takes to do it, they'll do it. That's why I'm asking. Thank you.
Lee, go ahead, then Harvey. Lee, you got to unmute.
Yeah, I'm doing it. The promo for this had BALK as the title. Now, are you going to deal with the BALK and Giamatti, when he was commissioner, that brief time he was on a crusade against the BALK. That certainly has died down. But are you going to discuss that, and maybe you can explain what it is?
I don't know that anybody could explain what a BALK is, but that said, the publisher liked BALK for the title. We like, in the 19, I'm trying to remember my story now because I was writing about it some time ago, but, in the 1952 World Series, the Yankees were accused of balking basically every time they pitched. And after the fact, I think it was actually, Ricky was talking about it sort of, Lee, you might remember that. Maybe it was somebody else and I have to go back and look, but so the BALK stuff's been going on there all the time. I think the BALK is a fascinating topic because it is sort of a funny little cheating mechanism unique to baseball. But so, yeah, the title, we are going to talk about it in the pitching part.
All right, we've got Harvey and then Rich.
Dan, there was an article a long time ago in the Sunday New York Times magazine. It had Barry Bonds on the front or the cover, and it followed him as he did his workouts, because it was trying to do not so much an expose. This was before I think people started to realize what the steroids did. It showed how the steroids, the performance enhancing drugs, permitted him to recover more quickly. So he was working out a ridiculous amount of hours in the gym. Somewhere around 2002, 2003. The article, as a matter of fact, I just threw it out. I had it in my office for years, buried under stacks of stuff, and I've been trying to clean up. But you may want to try to look at that, because when you talk about people don't understand perhaps how the steroids work. And it's not that you just take a handful of them and shove them in your mouth and then hit a 500-foot home run. You got to build your muscles up, and it permits you to recover more quickly as you work out. Now, I've never used steroids. I've never hit a 500-foot home run. But that article was before the furor over the PEDs. And it followed him in his workouts. He was working out 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, which is ridiculous.
I'm not placing that article, but I know that in Game of Shadows they talked about his workouts. But it would be fun to find the article from before Game of Shadows, or before the steroids really came out.
It was the Sunday New York Times. It was the early 2000s.
That's true.
Thanks, Harvey. Rich Rogers.
Dan, thank you for your presentation. Within your book, do you do any correlation about the drug use in pro sports and the tolerance by a large segment of our society of drug use?
We do not tie sort of performance enhancing drug use to, generic to illegal recreational drugs. I think there's just too much there. I mean, obviously, you have the whole Pittsburgh drug scandals of the mid 80s. You had the Royals players in the early 80s. And you're right. And then we do talk a little bit about the fact that, amphetamines were used in World War II by all the militaries. And then in the 1950s, they just started exploding in sort of civilian use, diet pills and everything else. So we talk about that a little bit, but, so a little bit, but not maybe in the detail that it deserves, or that you might be interested in.
Okay. I'm just thinking maybe there's not such an outcry by a large segment of the public, because they have tolerance for drugs. So they're not going to get on the professional players about it.
Yeah.
And I got a question. Bill Rigney was part of the 51 Giants.
That's what you need.
And hold on. Part of the 51 Giants who have been accused, and whether true, not, whatever. And then you're saying again in 59. Find that a little surprising. So nothing between 51 and 59 pointed a finger at the Giants, and Rigney would go ahead and try something else.
There were some other stories in there. I mean, I didn't have them all. There was one story in 57, I think, where they were supposedly sign stealing. So I think that there were some other ones in there. The 50s, there was a lot of sign stealing in the 50s. The quote I had from Will Harridge was from something like 1954. Obviously, he was American League and not National, but I think he generally had the theme of, gee, there's no rules against it. We shouldn't do it. People shouldn't do it. But I don't know what we would do if we ever caught somebody anyway. But there was another Giant story. I think it was 57. I'd have to go back and look it up, Gary.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Just one other quick story, because you guys all remember the movie It Happened Every Spring, where Ray Milland has the stuff where he puts on the ball and it misses the bats. They actually wanted to have some baseball players in that movie, and Commissioner Chandler said they couldn't because it was too much like cheating. That seems sort of silly today, but it's interesting how even at the time, different kinds of cheating had sort of different connotations for people.
Dan, if I can just, the year before Valentine Davies did It Happens Every Spring, he did Miracle on 34th Street. So he was in a lot of stories.
Dan, can I get a word?
Frank, go ahead.
Well, you haven't mentioned what has been reported over the years as the main as a objection to taking drugs. but they have adverse effects that they can hurt a person, and that and if a person wants to destroy himself by taking drugs, that's his business, but it gives the drug taker an unfair competitive advantage over those who don't, and pressures those who are under borderline or didn't want to take drugs into taking them. Can you comment on that aspect?
Sure. I mean, that's all true. I mean, that is clearly the reason that they should be illegal, because of the health reasons, and because if people don't want to take them, if you have to take them to be competitive, then other people are forced to take them. I mean, so there's players who never made the major leagues that today are very bitter that they didn't take steroids. I mean, not that they didn't take steroids, but that other people took them and they refused, and they never had their shot at the majors, and other people that they thought they were better than did. So I absolutely agree with that. Absolutely.
Thanks, Frank. Carrie Smith.
Hold on, so yeah. So I wanted to know about Jack McDowell's accusation of Tony La Rossi using the Gatorade sign at Comiskey to steal signs. Is that?
I think it's probably true.
Is that
We looked
mentioned
at it
in
a
the
little
book?
bit. Yeah, we talked about it a little bit. I think he probably, there was just the number of stories, right? I mean, the Milwaukee Brewers were supposedly using the Bernie Brewer guy who was coming down the chute to steal signs. So yes, we did talk about it a little bit with La Russa.
Okay.
I mean, he was certainly accused by different people. I mean, I think there was quite a bit of smoke there.
Hey, Dan, we can't thank you enough for joining us tonight. Look forward to the book. Let's give
My
it up
pleasure.
to Dan Levitt. Dan, you'll keep me posted, and I'll send out, links when the book becomes available.
Thank you.
Spring. And, you're always welcome here. If anything else you're writing in the future, you could definitely hop aboard and speak to us as well.
Much appreciated.
No
This is
problem.
great.
Thank you again. Great presentation. Very informative. For the rest of you, we will come back in 2 weeks from tonight when we have Chris Epting on. I hope everybody has a great holiday. I will get this Zoom recording out hopefully tomorrow or Saturday at the latest. I will hang around here. For the rest of you, have a great night and take good care of yourselves. Be well.